Here in Chapter 19, we're going to start talking about international trade and integrate it into our arguments that we've been making so far about the economy. So first of all, let's ask ourselves the question, why do Americans buy goods made in other countries rather than making them at home? And why do other countries buy goods and services made in the United States rather than making it in their home? And home meaning their country. And then what advantages could be gained from international trade, if any? Those are the questions that we're going to be talking about international trade, and some of them may turn out to be quite surprising. Let's first of all do a little historical background. What are the U.S. trade patterns? In 2019, not too many years ago, we have good data here. The United States imported $3 trillion worth of goods and services and exported 1.6 trillion in goods and 0.9 in services. So if you add that together, that's $2.5 trillion in goods and services exported. So as you can see, we're running a trade deficit, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But let's remind ourselves what these terms mean. Imports are goods and services purchased from international sources, meaning from producers outside the United States. And exports are goods and services sold to those international sources or to our foreign buyers. So a quick example, we have a Volvo produced in Sweden. It's sold in the United States to an American who wants to drive a nice Volvo, and that would be an example of an import. Boeing produces Boeing produces an airplane in Seattle and sells it to Japan Airlines in a foreign country. That would be an example of an export. The United States does both, as you can see, measured in the trillions of dollars. We are the world's largest exporter of goods and services, but also simultaneously the world's largest importer as well. Let's take a look at something that might surprise you. With all the talk about international trade, it turns out the U.S. has a relatively low trading sector. Roughly about 12% of our GDP is bought and sold across borders, whereas for other countries like Great Britain, it's 30%. For South Korea, 44%. Look at Belgium, 70%. Now, part of that should not be particularly surprising. The smaller the country, generally, the higher is their trading sector, for some pretty obvious reasons. In the United States, we have a major car production area up in Detroit, up in another state of Michigan, and we have a major agricultural sector producing peaches down here in Georgia. You could easily see that when Georgia sells peaches to Michigan and buys cars from Michigan, if the states were separate countries, we would call those imports and exports. But because we're such a huge country, what would ordinarily be called imports and exports are just done inside the same country. But what about Belgium? Belgium's a tiny country. If Belgium wants to buy computers or cars or whatever, what's the chance they're being made in their tiny country? Very low. So Belgium has to export a lot of goods and services in order to get the money to buy things like cars and other things that they aren't producing themselves. So generally speaking, the smaller the country, the larger is their export sector. All other things held constant. But there's a lot of political factors as well that might skew that number, so you can't just simply assume it. For instance, North Korea is a relatively small country, and their trade sector is zero. But that's all politically imposed. That's not what would naturally happen if people were permitted to buy and sell based on their own self-interest. Now let's take a look at the trade balance. The trade balance is a formula that says the trade balance is equal to exports minus imports. If the number comes up negative, we say we have a trade deficit. If the number comes up positive, we say we have a trade surplus. Now let's get back to that issue of motivation to trade. Why does anyone trade at all? We said the Belgians trade a huge amount. The Americans trade a smaller percentage, but still a large dollar amount. Why does anyone trade at all? It all comes down to two concepts that tie together: specialization and comparative advantage. Specialization means instead of choosing to do everything, you choose to do one thing, and you get really, really good at it. Let me give you a quick example. Why doesn't everybody in the United States move to a small farm, grow all their own food, make all their own clothing, build their own house, build their own furniture, and do everything themselves and trade with no one else. I mean, it's physically possible to do that, but I think as soon as you say it, you start to realize, wait a minute, how good could I possibly be at all those different trades? Since you're constantly moving from one trade to another, you never become really good at any one thing, right? Well, in the modern world, we've chosen to do the exact opposite. What we do instead is we become an expert at one thing. For instance, I'm studying accounting to become a CPA. That's clearly specialization. So instead of making all my own clothes, making my own car, building my own house, instead I become an expert at one thing. I do complex taxes. And in return, I import from other people everything else I need. I buy my house from other people, I buy my clothes from other people, I buy my food from other people, and I spend all my time working my 50 hours a week, and I do only taxes. Well, every one of us has done that. How about the carpenters on the construction site? They're doing it too, right? They build houses which they sell to other people, and then when they get the money, they buy the food rather than making their own food. They buy clothing instead of making their own clothing. So virtually everybody in a modern society has specialized. The reason we do this is when you specialize in something, you're able to apply both more sophisticated knowledge to a particular problem, and you can apply more specialized physical capital to the problem, and it makes you incredibly more productive rather than trying to do everything. Okay? So once we recognize that that's pretty much the way anyone living in a modern society with lots of goods and services is going to have to do specialization. And then the next thing to figure out is, what should I specialize in? Let's do a quick, easy example. You hate math and you're not really good at it, but you're incredibly good at talking to people, making them comfortable, and showing them the advantages of doing what you want them to do. You have two careers in front of you. One is to become a CPA, and the other is to become a professional salesperson. Well, doesn't everybody recognize if you don't like math, don't specialize in a math-intensive job, right? You'll never be good at it because it's not your thing. So my point, of course, is if you're a smart person, and most of us are smart enough about these things, you don't have to be academically smart, just street smart. You have to be aware of yourself and your surroundings. If you're not good at math, go into sales. If you're really, really good at math, but you're not a good people person, don't go into sales. Go into IT. Go into accounting. Go into engineering. Anything that's math-oriented, even if you're not a particularly social person, you can still do very, very well. The point is, we need to find something for which we have an advantage. Now, in economics, we have a special name for this kind of advantage that you're really good at. It's called comparative advantage. And we're going to go through an example in a moment that illustrates where that advantage comes from. But right now, what we're making the argument is, just like you as an individual need to choose between the math-intensive career and the people skills-intensive career to specialize in, nations as a whole do the same thing. Okay? So if you are a nation like Germany, which is incredibly good at engineering and making things and fixing things, does it make sense for Germany to specialize in agriculture or specialize in making machinery and cars? Well, that's pretty obvious, right? In the US, we have a very, very good culture for dealing with IT technology. We have the best nerds in the world, so to speak, and young people really adapt well to computer technology in the US. So we tend to educate a lot of people in computer science, and the US has some of the best tech companies in the world, Google and Apple, and well, I'm not going to name them all, but you all recognize all these brand names that the US produces in the high technology field. And that's because the US has a very strong advantage culturally in getting people up to speed on computer related stuff. I could go on and on for every single country in the world. They all have a comparative advantage in something, whether it's growing tea, whether it's growing, like Ukraine happens to be a major producer of grain. It turns out that Ukraine is mostly a huge plain, just like Kansas. It's a huge non-mountainous country that is perfect for growing grain, and the Ukrainians do that. Rather than produce some other good that they're not particularly good at, They are one of the world's major grain producers. So I could go into all kinds of examples of different specializations that people choose and countries choose based on either the natural talent of their people or the culture of their people or just the natural geography. For instance, is it obvious why Saudi Arabia specializes in oil production when they're sitting on one of the largest oil fields in the world? Well, of course that makes sense for them to specialize in oil production. For them to say, no, we're not going to do oil, we're going to try to grow crops in the desert, well, you realize how ridiculous a choice that would have been. So every country needs to specialize to become good at what they're doing, and they need to choose something for which they have a comparative advantage to specialize in. So once we take all this specialization, what's the result? Well, it turns out that total production increases for the same amount or even fewer resources, in particular labor resources. The more specialized you become, the better you are at doing whatever it is you're doing. And if you specialize in the thing that for which you have a comparative advantage, your total productivity rises dramatically, and you're able to trade for the other things that you're not particularly good at, and you simply buy them from others who themselves are specializing in those other issues. So total production rises with fewer resources used. So we can satisfy more wants and needs, and you can have a higher standard of living in all countries that trade. So let's compare now using language. We're not going to describe countries. Countries can either be closed economies or open economies. Now, of course, very seldom are they extreme on either end. Most countries, it'll be somewhere in the middle. They'll be partly closed and partly open. But what do the terms themselves mean? A closed economy, if it was absolutely closed, means there's no international trade. Each country produces all of its own consumption the same way that I described that subsistence farmer living on their own small farm produces all their own clothes, all their own food, all their own housing. Everything they do is done for themselves on their own farm. So a closed economy does that within the borders of their country. The closest example we have to a truly closed economy is North Korea. For political reasons, North Korea chooses not to trade with the outside world, except a small amount of trade with China, but overall they are the closest example of a closed economy. So the consumption possibilities of the North Korean people must equal its production possibilities. The total production you can do on your own soil determines what your people can consume. Now, let's take a look at an open economy. An open economy means it's open to international trade. That's where the term comes from. So open economies have international trade. So each country chooses to specialize in something, usually whatever they have a comparative advantage in, produces a lot of it, and then sells it to others to gain things and buy from others the things that it's not particularly good at producing. So it turns out that the consumption possibilities of each country can exceed its production possibilities. That's what's really interesting about open economies. It turns out trade makes it possible to consume above your own country's productive capacity because we've given up producing the things we're not particularly good at, so we can specialize in the things we're really good at, overproduce that item, and then trade with the rest of the world and actually have more goods of all kinds from imports and our own production of our specialized good than we would if we did the North Korea route and produce everything ourselves with our own people and our own resources. Here's an example. We're going to go through it relatively quickly, but this is the example that your author has in the textbook. And we need to take a look at, this is a made-up example for the first thing to recognize. So all the numbers we made up just strictly so we could have a nice, easy example to talk about. In real life, these things are a little more difficult to figure out. We're going to assume that both the US and France are both capable of producing bread and capable of producing wine. To produce bread, you need to be a major grain grower, right? You need to grow a lot of wheat. And to produce wine, you need to grow a lot of grapes. Plus, you need the machinery and everything else it takes to reap the wheat. So you need combines and tractors to do the wheat. And for wine, you need people skilled in taking care of grapes and also all of the vats and all of the fermentation equipment in order to produce wine. So both countries are going to need a combination of both labor and capital in order to produce either bread or wine. Now, what does it cost to produce wine in the United States? Well, here's our production possibilities frontier for the US. It's this blue line right here. What it's showing is the trade-off between producing bread and wine. So let's think about this issue. If we want to produce bread, what's the opportunity cost of producing more bread? Well, if we transfer resources and workers to wheat and bread production, what has to happen to wine production? It has to go down. How much does it go down? That's what the opportunity cost is. Okay? So let's look at some data here. We're going to go from point D to point C. Point C has more bread, and that's what we're trying to do. You notice point D has what, 40 units of bread, and point C has 60 units of bread. So we're going to increase bread by 20 units of total production. But to do that, what has to happen to wine production? Do you realize at point D we have what, 30 units of wine? At point C we have 20 units of wine. So to gain the 20 units of bread, we lose 10 units of wine. So 20 to 10 is the same ratio as 2 to 1. So it turns out that in order to produce wine, to gain bread, we lose half a unit of wine, or vice versa. To gain wine, we lose 2 units of bread. So wine in the United States, each unit of wine costs us 2 units of bread. We're not going to do this in money. We're going to look at the actual physical trade-offs that we have to make. Now, in France, and unfortunately the data numbers are covered, I'll just tell you what they were. Let's look at the data in France. Now, unfortunately, the author picked numbers that don't fall on the line nice and easy, but it turns out that, as you can see, if we're starting off at producing K, we have what, close to 48 units of wine and around what, 4 units of bread. And when we move to point I, we have what, 25 units of wine and we have 10 units of bread. If you look really closely at the numbers, it turns out to be, it's a 4-to-1 ratio. In other words, for every loaf of bread the French gain, they have to give up 4 units of wine. And you can see that, right? The distance here of collapsing wine trade to get this much bread is a quite considerable amount of wine. Now I'm going to make up a story as to why this is true. Well, France is farther north than most of the United States. France, most of Europe is much farther north. People don't realize how far south most of the U.S. is. So for instance, Rome, Italy. Most people think of Rome as being, oh, that's way south Italy, right? In Europe, that's a very southern place. If you look at a map, Rome lines up almost perfectly with New York City. How many of y'all think of New York as being a southern place? Well, you don't, right? But in the United States, it's a northern place relative to the rest of the United States. The reason I bring this up is, in France, growing wheat is expensive. It turns out the ground is not very good for it. There's too many rolling hills. There's not enough plains not plains like airplanes, but the flat level ground. Whereas in the United States, we have entire states, like the state of Kansas, is one humongous farm because it's perfectly flat land and it grows wheat fantastically. So in the United States, growing wheat is cheap, whereas in France, growing wheat is expensive. So if the French want to bulk up the wheat production, they have to give up a lot of wine production just to get a little bit more wheat. Whereas in the United States, no. You can gain wheat very, very easily and only sacrifice a small amount of wine. So given those numbers, if 1 unit of wine costs 2 units of bread in the US, but 1 unit of wine costs 4 units of bread in France, what should France be producing? Should they be producing bread, or should the US be producing the bread? Well, it should be pretty obvious, right? We should be producing way more bread in the US and cut back on wine production, and in France, do the exact opposite. Cut back on bread production and increase wine production. What will that gain for both countries? Well, let's take a look now at the dots that's here. In the US, we started off at point D, producing 40 units of bread and 30 units of wine. We cut way back on the wine to only 20 units in order to produce 60 units of bread. So now we have 20 extra units of bread, but we're short 10 units of wine. With the extra units of bread, we can keep some of the bread for ourselves and sell the excess bread to France. And so ultimately, the the US can consume way out here at point N. This means this is consumption with trade, meaning with all of the extra bread we've produced, because we have a low-cost production of bread, it's way easy to produce bread in Kansas. We can produce a lot of extra bread and export it to France. And what does France do at the same time? France moves from point I, which is the initial production without trade, and decides we're going to tear up all of our wheat, or at least a big chunk of our wheat fields, and we're going to produce way over here in wine. We're going to turn our wheat fields into wine growing region because it's way better at growing wine, and we're going to cut back on our bread. But instead of starving to death by not having bread to eat, we're going to buy the bread from the Americans. What are we going to pay for the bread with? Well, they're going to pay for it with all the extra wine they're producing. Because if the US is producing extra wheat, we have a shortage of wine, but the French are producing extra wine, they have a shortage of wheat. So the US exports wheat to France, France exports wine to the United States, and both countries end up being better off than they would be if they grew all of their own wheat and made their own bread and made all of their own wine. And why is that? Just like with two people, if one person's a great math person, specialize in accounting, another person's great with dealing with people, specialize in sales, and the two of you separately, by specializing in your area that you're really good at, will earn a higher income than you otherwise would have, and you simply buy the stuff from other people that you're not very good at. Well, we're making the same argument essentially for countries as a whole, but using a much more technical argument. But the underlying argument is literally the same. Nations should specialize in the things that they can do at low cost and give up producing the things that are very high cost. And if both countries do that and trade their surpluses, they're able to buy the things that they're not very good at more cheaply than they could have produced them themselves.